Okay, well, it's 12:02, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here for our Lunch and Learn session. Thank you to Esmeralda for serving as a co-host and watching to let people in if I'm not able to. And thank you, Tony, for recording. Regardless of the results of all of the elections and when we finally get them, we know that there's work that still needs to be done. That never changes. And so with us today from the Social Action Office of the Diocese is Kent Ferris, our director, and then Glenn Leach and Loxie Hopkins. And they're going to speak to us a little bit about, okay, here's what's happened, here's how we go forward based on that. So that's our what, so what, now what title for today. So Kent, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amy. We will begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God of all compassion, you call us to love one another as you have loved us, especially when we face division in our communities. Help us to see our sisters and brothers as beloved children of God. Help us to fast from incivility and feast on your love for each one of us. Help us to fast from discord and feast on the knowledge that you have created each person in your own image. Help us to fast from fear of those with whom we disagree and feast on the joy community brings us. Help us to fast from timidity when we hear hurtful language and feast on sharing the good news of our God-given dignity. Help us to fast from the desire to win arguments and feast on compassion shared and understanding. Help us to fast from assumptions and feast on listening deeply to the stories of our community. Lord our God, be with us in this time of hurt in our communities. In our fasting, may we grow closer to you. In our feasting, let us find healing. Let us turn to you as the source of our joyfulness and our first giver of love. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The first thing I want to say is we have a tendency to think of certain portions of our life as beginning, middle, and end. And then beginning, middle, and end. And I think some of what I would hope to share with you today is it's not always that clean. It's often beginning and middle, and then the beginning of another piece before the end of the other one. I think that the results not being known yet of one of the offices is an example of where the end we haven't concluded the election process. Likewise, the conversation and some of the topics that we're going to talk about today go back a month or two in anticipation of legislative sessions that will come in January or February, either in Des Moines or in Washington. And so I want to share with you both the sources of information that our office receives, and then also give you some specifics as to what we continue to look at, and in order to talk about the now what part of the presentation. Our office, serving the bishop's office, has different sources of information, and the first category of sources is more the formal relationships. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Iowa Catholic Conference of Bishops, Catholic Relief Services. They will provide us information about issues and ask of us to be involved at different times. On September 28th, the Immigration Task Force for the Iowa Catholic Conference met. And at that point, we were already beginning to look at the next State House session in Des Moines in January, not knowing who would be representing us. On that call, there were several items that I want to let you know about, and they will be ones that we will look at and see if there's the type of support that we may be able to get movement on. One of them is state-issued temporary driver's license for those without documentation. It has been achieved in other locations. It becomes a matter of public safety, often has the support and buy-in of law enforcement in order that they know who they're dealing with. And so it is on the radar of the Iowa Catholic Conference and probably other groups as well. On that same call, there was discussion about repealing Iowa's English-only language from within Iowa code in order to acknowledge the many languages spoken and the many cultures that make up our Iowa, the state of Iowa. Additionally, on that same call, there was attention given to working to protect physical and economic security of workers in particularly dangerous situations by virtue of the pandemic, including meat plants and care centers that they may not have anticipated prior to the pandemic. Additionally, the Iowa Catholic Conference has also had a board meeting a few weeks back, October 22nd, and there were a couple of items that were mentioned there that may also be on their radar as we approach the next State House session, including moving toward a state constitution change reflecting the right of the unborn to be protected against the violation of abortion, and also anticipating the possibility that there may be a move towards legalizing marijuana in Iowa. And the Minnesota Catholic Conference has a website, learnaboutsam.org, and they referenced it as a possible source of information if indeed that particular type of legislation were to be introduced at the State House. The second source of information, the second source of information that we receive is more based on our relationships, our ecumenical or our interfaith relationships. And as an example, Bread for the World, a few months back, in fact, I think it was August, Zach Schmidt from Bread for the World Midwest had about a half a dozen or dozen of us in this part of the state attend 2 Zoom calls. And the guest on each of those Zoom calls were Marionette Miller Meeks and Rita Hart. And Bread's reason for doing so was to hear their thoughts on the issue of domestic and foreign hunger, as well as saying to them, whichever of you wins, please know we will be coming back to you, and we hope to be able to establish a working relationship based on mutual self-interest. As you may have read, the results of that one are very close. I don't know if the results are so close that it will automatically trip in a recount, but in any case, it was by virtue of that relationship with Bread that our office and the diocese was able to be part of a conversation with people that were at the point candidates, done in a nonpartisan manner. Additionally, NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which has an Iowa chapter, is also a group that we have contact with, and there are moments when the Iowa Catholic Conference, for example, meets and connects with NAMI. They have 3 priorities that I think I wanted to make sure to let you know about, and ones that we may be watching as we approach the next State House session. Their priorities are to establish an adequate and sustainable funding system for adult and children mental health services. The second one is to preserve Medicaid funding and programs, as well as make any changes necessary to assure appropriate behavioral services for clients and timely and adequate payment for providers. The third thing that NAMI is very concerned about is expanding the use of telehealth by making permanent the payment parity and structure changes in 2020 in response to the pandemic. Here again, I think both Brad and NAMI help us be able to appreciate that there's a myriad of issues. We have to know where we find mutual interest with other groups. And then the other part of it too is to find local parishioners that have that level of interest and they want to pursue that type of additional involvement. The third group of folks that we hear from and get information about are local pastors, parishes, and involved parishioners. And I have three examples of instances that we've had most recently that we too will be mindful of as we talk to elected officials, either representing us in Washington, D.C. or Des Moines. The first that came by way of a kind of a difficult conversation with a local pastor who said to me, in the absence of a second pandemic stimulus package, I now find myself ministering to parishioners who may be even in their late 50s, who because of medical conditions find themselves unable to safely return to the workforce at this time. And his comment was, Kent, where's the safety net? Where's the support that they need? That is a reality amidst a pandemic that we have to carry forward and advocate for as we approach a legislative session. The second is the skyrocketing need for adequate mental health service resources. And again, this is with a conversation with a pastor who's referencing the Catholic school connected with the church and saying that they're looking to provide additional counseling support to the children because of the marked increase in mental health issues, again, amidst a pandemic. So that was an example of where I'm hearing from the pastor, I'm watching what NAMI's doing, and we have to accumulate those lived experiences in order to help people that are in great need. The third piece is the issue of folks continuing to live, who live and work in poverty, and the reality of evictions and foreclosures. And this is an example of where you read about it in the papers, but we see it locally. And Linda Molyneux, who is on this call, has a great passion about this, a great understanding of these types of issues and the challenges that we face. Very quickly, I'm going to just ask Linda to kind of provide a thumbnail of what that looks like for people. What is the challenge of eviction, the notices that they receive? Linda.
Well, just so you know my background, I retired about 2 years ago, after 40 years out of law school. My second job, I worked as a part-time magistrate. I was a judge in small claims court, which included eviction court. The last 25 years, I was a legal services attorney. And while I specialized in family violence cases, I also knew a lot about eviction because every legal services attorney has to understand how evictions work, just because of the sheer volume of them. And of course, it affects the stability of the families that I would be representing in family law cases as well. Eviction for non-payment of rent is the most common type of eviction in Iowa. And as a general rule, if the landlord follows the right procedure to bring the case to court, the person will be evicted. And in Scott County, concretely, what that means is that if you have an eviction hearing on a Tuesday afternoon and you are ordered to move, you have until that Friday or the following Monday to move. And if you don't do that, the landlord can ask the sheriff to come out. Then you no longer have a right to be there, and your personal property can be set out on the curb. Just imagine that. Now, in most cases, the tenant does owe rent. So legal services attorneys do something that's sort of disfavored by attorneys. We look for technical defenses. We look to see how the notices were given. Were they given in the right order? Did they have the right language? Was the timing correct? Did the landlord file the case too soon? And it seems, I think, well, that's just ridiculous. You're just having a technical defense. It doesn't really address the issues. And the thing that I am passionate about right now is the notice itself. It's called a 3-day notice to cure or quit. And cure means you have a right to pay the rent. If you are able to pay it within the cure period, the landlord cannot proceed to evict you. And if the landlord refuses what you've offered within the cure period, if you offer the full amount, then that would be a basis to dismiss an eviction, because the policy underlying this is truly, we want to be able to preserve tenancies. But the problem is that the cure period is so short that realistically it's a farce. There is no realistic opportunity to recover from what might be a very short-term setback. Maybe I was sick and I couldn't work and I don't have paid sick leave. Maybe my hours were cut at work. There can be all sorts of reasons why I wasn't able to pay then, but 3 days, and I know you don't want to hear all the technicalities, but it's an extraordinarily short period of time depending on how the notice is given. 3 days does not give a person realistic chance to communicate with an agency, with family, friends, to get that money. And what they really have to do is they have to have that money in their hand within the 3 days and give it to the landlord. Otherwise, the tenancy is lost. And obviously, it's so important in a pandemic, but it's so important going beyond a pandemic to preserve housing for tenants. And, there are other bigger issues, like if that housing is always safe and affordable, that makes it easier to be able to pay your rent. But things happen, and I just feel that it's a totally backward situation that a tenant only has 3 days to try to come up with the payment of the rent.
The three categories. Thank you, Linda, for both the information and that you will be hearing more about this particular matter as we proceed forward. The last thing I want to say before I turn it over to my colleague Glenn is this: I provided 3 categories of information: the formal sources of information, the kind of the ancillary community relationships that we have, and then ultimately the word from the people on the ground who can describe the lived experience. These are not mutually exclusive categories. They form the other categories. And ultimately, our responsibility as constituents is to describe to the elected officials what's going on. As evictions, as an example, is something that can actually form policy. And that's what our intention is to do. And with that and no more, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Glenn Leach. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Works much better with the microphone on. I had some prepared remarks, but they were prepared on the basis that hopefully there would be a lot of folks on the call today that were new to the topic, were new to advocacy and so forth. But looking at the attendance list, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. So I'm going to modify my remarks just a little bit. Earlier in discussing the Iowa Catholic Conference's Immigration Coalition, Kent mentioned the fact that we want to do away with the English-only law because there are other languages spoken in Iowa. I'm a part of a statewide hookup of on an immigrant coalition, and participating with that group from the early moments of the COVID-19, we realized that we had a real problem because there are 27 languages and 75 different dialects spoken in Iowa. And that's particularly true in the larger metropolitan areas, but it's also true in the smaller areas surrounding certain industries such as the meat packing plants. And although the numbers are not fantastically large compared to the total population, these were people who, by and large, were not getting good information about how to protect themselves, how to protect their families, and so forth. Well, it happens I'm also a member of the Iowa Disaster Human Resources Council, which is a coordinating group that helps to provide information and assistance in the event of an emergency. As a result of learning what we did about the immigrant situation, we created a subcommittee to the IDHRC that is working on methods of getting information out to immigrant and refugee communities. And sometimes the challenges are kind of unique because there are many people, particularly amongst the the refugee groups, that are not even literate in their own languages. So we've had to do such things as go to videos with native speakers that can be posted on YouTube so that people with phones, which is just about everybody in Iowa, immigrant and refugee included, has a phone. But this is the mechanism that we had to use to get the information out. And following up on Linda's comments, Iowa Legal Aid is going to be holding a seminar this month. I can give you details if you're interested, but they're holding a separate seminar just to address the various legal aspects of disasters. And there are many. I won't bother you with all of the details, but although the webinar is intended for pro bono lawyers, all of us could learn a lot from just sitting in on it as to the problems that are faced, the clues that we may need in order to get information out to the various groups that we represent. During the run-up to the election, we had a lot of stuff on TV, on the phones and so forth, but it was all pretty broad and pretty general and didn't get down into little details like 46 million of us living below the poverty line. And as we know, the poverty line is a ridiculously low level. The official poverty guidelines for families is probably about 40% to 50% lower than what it actually takes to survive. So what I had planned to conclude with is a video that does two things. One, if you look, it features a woman from West Virginia. She's a woman with a master's degree and 2 jobs working in West Virginia. Many of you may have even seen this video before, because if you look closely in the background, you will see people in the audience at this hearing of the House Finance Committee that have name tags on. And the name tags, all you can read in the video is nuns. It's nuns on the bus. These are the folks that help to facilitate that. And they are an example of the types of things that we need to be allied with, that we need to be working with to advance the cause of justice, regardless of party. And so with that, I'm going to start the video. Hopefully I can share my screen. Go to this. Can you see the woman?
Yes, Glenn.
Okay, we'll go ahead then.
We're not getting the audio much though. I see a few nods. Also, I have the video included in the resources that I'll be sending out after the Lunch and Learn ends. So everybody would have an opportunity to view that themselves afterwards too. So, because we are at 12:29, so. Okay, so Glenn, was that the wrap up of yours then, was the video?
That was the wrap up of mine.
All right,
Get
thank you so
involved
much.
and stay involved.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll go ahead and move on to Loxie then.
Hello. I have an audio that I want to play first, or have Amy play, because I don't know how to do it. So Amy, if you would play the audio first. This is on racism.
Okay, and I'm crossing my fingers that I can get the audio. If I can't, everybody give me a big thumbs down. So, yes, no.
I hear music.
Father Brian, we're talking now as activists and protesters nationwide are demanding justice for George Floyd and seeking an end to systemic white supremacy. You wrote an article for National Catholic Reporter in which you say that Amy Cooper holds the key to understanding racism in the United States. What did you mean by this?
Great question, thank you. Let me tell you a bit about how that essay came to be. It was Pentecost weekend, and even though people call me a progressive Catholic, I'm still old school enough in my spirituality to believe in novenas. And I was in the midst of the 9 days of praying before Pentecost, and that Monday before Pentecost was when the incident happened in Central Park, when Amy Cooper, a white woman, basically called the police on an African-American man, Christian Cooper, who, no relation, who simply asked her to comply with the posted park regulations and leash her dog. And she did indeed do so, saying that there was an African-American man who was threatening her. And that it didn't receive as much publicity because that same day, that was when the murder of George Floyd took place in Minneapolis, and the nation's attention fixated on that horrific outrage. And so that week, as I was praying, I found I just could not pray. I couldn't, and I would be praying, there were tears that were falling. And I knew people wanted me to say something. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what to say. And then it occurred to me that Amy Cooper held the key, that if we understand what happened in Central Park, it tells us a great deal about what we mean by white privilege, white supremacy, and why these more blatant outrages occur. We see a white woman who exemplified all of the unspoken assumptions of whiteness. Namely, she assumed that she would be presumed innocent. She assumed that the Black man would be presumed guilty. She assumed that the police would back her up. She assumed that as a white woman, her lies would hold more credibility than his truth. She assumed that she would have the presumption of innocence. She assumed that the Black man would have a presumption of guilt. She assumed that the police would back her up. She assumed that his race would be a burden. And she assumed that she had the upper hand in the situation. She assumed that she could exploit deeply ingrained white fears of Black men. And she assumed that she could keep these deeply ingrained white fears to keep a Black man in his place. And it occurred to me that she knew exactly what she was doing. That's why she did what she did.
I should have introduced
Every one of us.
Whoops. That was Father Brian Massingale that you were all listening to. I've had the opportunity to listen to him in person a couple of times, and I think he's so impressive that it's worth purchasing his books and listening to his videos. And I think, will we have the complete video of that, Amy, available? Or okay. I don't know if all of you have read the Pastoral Letter Against Racism written by the U.S. bishops, Open Wide Our Hearts. It's really outstanding. I thought, we've all been dealing a lot about racism and racism issues, and I think that the George Floyd murder brought it all to the forefront for everyone, and our own complicity in racism as a white woman, my complicity. But what I loved about this document was the fact that in the document, they talk about the Catholic Church's oppression of people through the generations. And I think it's important that we confront who we are as individuals and as a church before we can make any changes at all. I am working with a group from St. Anthony's who have started this study. We last Thursday started it. We'll have our second session this week. So what I want to do at this time is encourage all of you in all of your parishes to read this document and start study groups about it. I think it's a wonderful way to begin learning about who we are as people and where our prejudices are. It was interesting in the group last week when we found that all of us that grew up in small communities had been raised with an awful lot of bias and prejudices that we had no idea were even racist. Now we're looking back at our childhoods and realizing some of the things that we grew up with were pretty horrific. And so it's always been my belief that people are not necessarily racist or prejudiced out of hatred, but more so out of ignorance and the lack of opportunities to be with a diverse group of people. So we're running out of time at this point, and I think that with all that's been presented, you probably have a lot of questions. So I'm going to open it up for questions on any of the topics we've talked about.
What I will do is unmute people as you raise your hands, or as I said, you can send your questions or comments to the chat. So, Sister Jan?
I was wondering if there's any discussion, I suppose it would be particularly at the Iowa Catholic Conference level, about legislation around two areas, one in particular, criminal justice reform. Iowa has one of the top prison populations percentage-wise of African Americans. And the second one, which is a broader one, is around income inequality, to work on things that are specific to that.
Sister Jan, I think the first one, if I can, there's a group that deals with, that has taken on racial injustice as it relates to mass incarceration. Alan Hayes is his name. He may very well be out of like Cedar Falls, Waterloo area. And we've tried to stay in contact with Alan and the work that he's done. There was actually a lobby day at the state capitol last session prior to the beginning of the pandemic. Though there is not a particular piece of legislation, because it's still very early, the Iowa Catholic Conference, as an example, would be a group that would be supportive of the types of criminal justice reforms that you're talking about. It may not necessarily be that it comes directly and immediately from the conference itself. It may be a matter of piggybacking with another group, as Alan's group is, for example. The income inequality, you only have to go back a couple of years, and we received this request from the chief lobbyist with the Iowa Catholic Conference in December. And his comment was, will you please reach out to your state house senator or state house rep and ask them 3 questions? And this was, at that point, it was actually targeting Republican legislators. There was, one of the questions was, would you be willing to support an increase to the minimum wage? Because what they were trying to do was to determine whether there was any sort of bipartisan support in doing so. There wasn't. And so that in that session, there was no movement on increasing the minimum wage. However, there was more appetite for increasing the earned income tax credit. And so there was expansion of that, separate from, you know, the inability to move the minimum wage, which hasn't been moved in a long time, and which is what, $7.25. So yeah, I've written the notes, Sister Jan, and it's all about giving folks input, and I know income inequality is not minimum wage alone. I appreciate that, but when there are other elements of it that we need to be mindful of, absolutely, we will address.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to let everybody know that in the resources that will come out shortly after, I don't know if they'll be out this afternoon or tomorrow, but there is a page in the social action portion of the diocesan website where Esmeralda always links to the current Iowa Catholic Conference legislative priorities page. And currently it's pointing to the page that was created for this past session. I believe that the legislative priorities for this next upcoming session are still in draft form, but as soon as those are released, Esmeralda always updates our link to make sure that we have the current resources linked from our site. And we can keep an eye on that and send a notice out for everybody to kind of check those. And I'm trying to remember, Glenn, Loxie, Ken, you will probably know better than I would, but occasionally, do they specifically identify legislation, or do they simply talk about the principles and then wait until the session starts? Glenn, you're shaking.
The conference works in two ways. One, it sets its priorities. These are a statement of the things that we would like to see, and also the way we will look at legislation as it flows through the sessions. The conference will jump on any piece of legislation that they really want to emphasize, or one that they feel is not in the best interest of people, and will try to marshal support for having that one turned down. But Kent made a very important point in that income inequality has a lot of parts. The minimum wage is one. It's right now it's $7.25 for regular workers, $2.13 for tip workers. That's the federal minimum, and that has not been changed in over 11 years. Unfortunately, our legislature overturned Johnson County's efforts to raise the minimum wage in various towns in the county. Several of them had raised their minimum wage and were on a progressive path to raising it even further, when the legislature said, no, we won't have any of that. We can't have piecemeal minimum wages. We've got to have uniformity. And of course, as we have a single party dominating the legislature at the moment, a party which is not known for supporting the minimum wage, they passed a regulation that kept the minimum wage throughout Iowa at $7.25. And Kent also points out.
No,
Sorry,
I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish.
Sorry, Lex, go ahead.
The idea is that we can work, we probably won't make a lot of progress at the moment on the minimum wage, although it is definitely worth trying. But the other parts, such as the earned income tax credit, more access to health care, and other elements that figure into income inequality, are all things that we can work on.
Kent, if people that are on here today want to influence the priorities of the Iowa Catholic Conference, who should they address their information to?
They can do one of two things. They can directly contact Tom Chapman, the chief lobbyist for the 4 bishops of the state of Iowa, and absolutely send him a note and say, you know, we understand that there may be conversations that you're asking local folks to have prior to the State House session. Consider this as well. What I've appreciated with the conversations about Tom is he wants to hear from folks. He wants for them to say what's going on and to be able to understand the challenges that local folks face. The more specific we can get about challenges in different parts of the state, the more targeted those types of efforts can be. So, you know, Tom, as well as CCing us, because if we find that we've got folks that are genuinely concerned about the cost of living or the lack of affordable housing, there are efforts that are undertaken locally, Clinton, Davenport as examples. That type of energy and knowledge as to what's going on really allows us to be much more targeted when we're talking to those that represent us.
Glenn, I was just going to say that I believe at the time that the legislature shut down the ability for counties to adjust the minimum wage at the county level, I think Lee County had started looking at raising the minimum wage. So there was a little, I mean, again, just 2 counties, but there was a little bit of momentum going. So one thing we've talked about in the Social Action Office is the idea that if we could rally 5 people out of each of the diocese 22 counties, am I correct on that? 22?
Right.
Yeah, if we could marshal 5 people out of each of the 22 counties, and those 5 people would call their representatives on issues, that can make a big difference, believe it or not. It's not, you don't have to have a huge number of people for it to have an impact. So, you know, if there are particular issues that people are interested in and they're starting at their local community level to try to rally support, please do reach out to the Social Action Office, because we may be able to help you identify others either through our Google groups or through the newsletter that we put out to connect people across this third of the state and help you support those initiatives.
The other thing I would add, in these times of Zoom calls, if you have a social action commission at your parish, you can extend an invitation to folks early enough and prior to the beginning of a legislative session, and just ask them, can we have 15 minutes of your time? Here are 3 things we want to make sure that you know that we're very passionate about, and we will be back in contact with you as the session unrolls. The other part of it too is in Muscatine a few years ago, I actually had a parishioner who was my State House representative. So there was a moment where there were 3 of us around a coffee table in the rectory, and we're talking with both our parishioner as well as the person that represents us. And, you know, it was very informal. It wasn't in the midst of a legislative session. It was just us talking to Gary, but he's representing us. And so it was an amazing opportunity, because there were people sitting around the table that had never talked with an elected representative expressing by way of our faith what we held to be of great concern. The other part of it too is Bread for the World was insightful in having Rita Hart on one call and Mariannette Miller Meeks on the other call. They're both Catholic. They're both members of the diocese, parishioners in different deaneries. And here again, at least when, you know, whoever, if it's Mariannette, you know, if her couple hundred votes stays the course and she's in office, she will have had some contact with people of faith and them sharing with her, you know, our concern for the least among us by virtue of who we are and what we believe.
I believe.
And the same would be true if the 285 vote difference goes away and Rita Hart, our parishioner,
Right.
takes office.
Right.
Glenn put out in the chat, Tom Chapman, who is the with the Iowa Catholic Conference. He put his email in there. I will include in the resources, if you have not signed up for the Iowa Catholic Conference mailing list, they do not bombard you with constant email messages. Typically during the legislative session, it's once a week. Occasionally, it might be 2 if there's some kind of a vote coming up that's really, really timely. But it's a great, great resource for knowing what's going on during the legislative session. And it may also be a great resource ahead of the legislative session if you're trying to get a hold of your representatives and catch their ear on something. Other questions, comments, experiences?
I have a question. This is Lynette. And I'm sorry I might not be knowledgeable enough in this, but one of the big issues during the election process was the president and his filling the occupancy on the Supreme Court, and of course one of the big cases that was going to be coming before them regarding the Obamacare. And my question was, regardless of who becomes if President Trump becomes president, obviously, I'm sure he's going to go forward with that. If President Biden were to become president, would that still go forward regardless? Would the Supreme Court be still addressing that issue? And then if so, have advocacy groups, have states, has anybody been working on something in the event that the Supreme Court would knock that down, the Obamacare down, or whether pre-existing conditions would no longer be a part of plans? Have people been working on, a worst case scenario of where do we go from here and how do we help people?
I'll let the Supreme Court advisor from our office take the question. That'd be Glenn.
The answer is yes, the case will still go forward irrespective of who is president. That doesn't affect the court's schedule at all. If the Obamacare is ruled null and void, Lynette, you are correct. All of the provisions of the present Obamacare, which includes the pre-existing conditions, the emphasis on preventive medicine, allowing children to remain on their parents' insurance until age 26, and other features of Obamacare will disappear. What we will have is a situation that's known as chaos, because there is no counter plan that has been proposed by either party at this point in time. The Democrats have hoped that Obamacare will not be overturned until there is something better. And to this point in time, we have not seen any, to my knowledge, even an outline of a plan from the Republican side of the House. In fact, Ms. Barrett, along with the other members of the Supreme Court yesterday, were holding hearings on the city of, I believe it was Philadelphia, Vice Catholic Charities. And that issue here is the Catholic Charities' refusal to place children with gay couples. So the Supreme Court's docket continues regardless of president.
To your point too, Lynette, though, as it would, if we're approaching a point where we would have millions of people who had been insured, and there was going to be not just a drop, but a precipitous drop in their type of support, both the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops would respond and provide us with direction and legislative alerts, action alerts, to be able to contact congressional representatives to say you have to have something to substitute for, if you're merely pulling out from underneath people coverage that they've had that they didn't have access to before. So that, I mean, in that respect, in the same way that the Iowa Catholic Conference is the Catholic presence at the state capitol, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops have staffers assisting the bishops in Washington as it relates to federal policy or legislation. So, and I'm sure they're mindful of the different ways that it could go and are trying to prepare those responses. Additionally, you've got groups like Network who are also watching and waiting and hoping to affect policy change as well. So there's other groups that have the common good at heart and in vision. So
part of the difficulty is that what we have come to call Obamacare consists of so many parts. Part of it was an expansion of Medicare, and under Obamacare, at least the first 2 years was picked up by the federal government. The expense of that expansion was picked up by the federal government to the tune of about 90%. The fate of that, if Obamacare goes away, and that's why I say the situation is chaos, because there are many pieces, and I've not heard who is trying to pick up the pieces.
The thing I most appreciate about Lynette's question is this. She is anticipating how legislation could affect real life locally. And it's not only for one's own personal interest, but those that we love and those that are our neighbors. And it's exactly what we want. We want people to be mindful of what is going on in our lives, and when it affects, it's based on what happens by way of legislation. We want to have the conversations to say how it is affecting us, because every single elected official that I've ever met said, what I want are personal stories. I want to know how what I'm saying yes to or what I'm going to say no to is going to affect my constituents, because the thing they genuinely want to serve. I believe that. But they're also looking at re-election. And if they don't understand the lived experience of their constituents, they're not going to be invited back. And so there's that dynamic. But ultimately, it is appreciating what it might mean, or asking, what will this mean if this happens? That's a great, thank you, Lynette, for your contribution.
Now that's an important point, because the legislators really need that kind of input, because they're operating in many cases, even though they're quite intelligent people, they're operating at the 10,000 foot level. They are seeing trends, they are seeing numbers. What they need to see are some of the actual impacts, things that may never have come to their attention before, things that may never have been discussed in committee hearings. They need to know how it's affecting people.
And that's where, Glenn, that video that unfortunately we weren't able to hear will be a good example of that. How one person can talk about what the actual impact is on people, on individuals, and bring those compelling stories. I just wanted to let you all know I'm happy to continue going, because this is great conversation. I do want to be respectful of anybody who might need to leave. So just very quickly, I wanted to let you know that our next Lunch and Learn will be December 3rd. And our speaker is going to be Thomas Mason IV. And he is with the St. Martin de Porres Society at Sacred Heart Cathedral. I also wanted to let you know that Glenn had prepared some remarks. And then when he saw our audience, he said we were all way too knowledgeable. But I had already planned to ask Glenn, because I felt his remarks were very well written and very important points. So I had already planned to ask him if I could include them in the next issue of the 2 Feet newsletter. So if you were wondering what he was going to say, that will be in the 2 Feet newsletter next week. And with that, I'll come back out, and if anybody else has questions, more comments, please feel free to continue.
Part of Glenn's comments was he's running for public office in 24. I'm his campaign manager. So you heard it here first.
Well, I actually hate to leave, but I've got to get back to the Chancellor's work now. So I appreciate very much having been a part of this, and you're all sharing. Just got to keep this all in prayer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lynette. Questions, comments, experiences from anybody else?
Sister B, do you have anything to add to our Open Wide Your Hearts? And Sister B is one of the conveners of the St. Anthony's group.
I really don't. I think, as you have stated, Loxie, that it is a wonderful document, and it's certainly probably a good beginning for people to delve into, and there's a lot more that could be said and learned, but it's certainly a good beginning. So as you were saying, I would encourage people to read the document if you haven't, and then to try to engage your parishes or friends, whoever, to conversation. Thank you.
Okay, well, if nobody has anything else, thank you all very much for being here today, and I hope to see you on another Lunch and Learn. Like I said, the resources with the links will be coming out hopefully by tomorrow. I'll keep you posted, but you will be getting those, and everybody enjoy your weekend.